Welcome to the deep dive. Grab a notebook, settle in, and get ready because we have a massively complex, highly debated topic on the docket today.
We really do.
Yeah. But before we even get started, do us a huge favor. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel right now. You are not going to want to miss a single second of what we do here.
Absolutely not.
Today, we are taking a magnifying glass to a fascinating, incisive, and ultra-long new 2025 ebook. It's making absolute waves across the internet, specifically within the manosphere.
It certainly is causing a stir. The rhetorical architecture in this text is unlike anything we've examined recently, and it requires a very careful, methodical breakdown.
That is an understatement.
Yeah.
The book we're looking at today is titled 80% of Men Are Depeopled. Women See Only the Top 20% of Men. It's written by Conrad Riker.
Right.
And whether you're deeply familiar with this space or brand new to these concepts, you're going to want to hear exactly how this author constructs his reality and his arguments.
Because it is comprehensive.
Exactly. In fact, if you want to follow along, verify his claims, or just read it for yourself, you can go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now. It is a dense, provocative read. Our goal today is to unpack the most crucial nuggets of knowledge from it for you.
But before we begin our analysis, it's imperative that we set some very clear ground rules for you, the listener.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yes. This text is highly politically charged. It is aimed directly at a men's rights activist, an MRA, and a red-pilled audience. We need to be explicitly clear here. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Not at all.
Our mission today is to impartially unpack the author's arguments. We want to understand his worldview regarding the history of our institutions and analyze the claims presented in the source text.
We're treating this as a sociological and philosophical artifact.
Exactly. We are here to examine the mechanics of how the author builds his case, not to validate or invalidate his politics.
We are your guides through this material, acting almost as anthropologists exploring a newly discovered ideological continent. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Here's the roadmap for our deep dive today. We're going to explore Riker's core claims about what he calls biological caste systems.
Yes.
We'll look at his argument regarding the alleged historical capture of Western institutions by cultural Marxists and modern intersectional feminism. And finally, we'll break down his ultimate proposed solution for his readers, a strategy of withdrawal he calls a digital exodus.
It's a sweeping, comprehensive worldview. And to understand it, we really have to begin with the very concept that gives the book its title, the depeopling.
The depeopling.
Right. This is Riker's foundational sociological premise. He argues that 80% of average men are effectively invisible to women.
Invisible.
In his view, they are not treated as human beings with interior lives or vulnerabilities or souls. Instead, they're treated as what he calls non-playable characters, NPCs.
Borrowing that term from video games.
Exactly, to describe background characters with no agency. Or he calls them resource generating units, RGUs.
The imagery he uses to describe this is incredibly stark. I want to spend a moment here because it really sets the tone for the entire book.
It does.
Right in the first chapter, he shares this opening anecdote. He describes himself standing behind a heavy mahogany bar. He's working as a bartender, mixing drinks for a group of women sitting right in front of him.
Yeah.
And he notes that they look right through him. He writes that it's as if he were a coat rack or a sentient vending machine.
A sentient vending machine.
Right. Because he's performing a utility, making drinks, and merely serving a function, he argues that he ceases to exist as a person in their perceptual field.
That anecdote is utilized to perfectly illustrate what Riker terms the solipsistic cage.
Let's slow down on that phrase, solipsistic cage.
Yeah.
For someone who might not be deep into philosophy, what does solipsism actually mean in this context?
Great question. In classical philosophy, solipsism is the idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Everything outside of your own mind, other people, the external world, might just be an illusion or a projection. Riker adapts this into what he calls emotional solipsism.
Emotional solipsism.
Right. He argues that modern women operate from a place where they view reality entirely through the lens of their own immediate subjective needs, their feelings, their comfort.
Interesting.
In this framework, they view men strictly through a lens of utility. If a man isn't actively providing resources, if he's not offering status validation, or if he isn't fixing an immediate problem, he is simply not perceived. He is filtered out of their reality.
He uses some very relatable, real-world examples to hammer this home. He talks about the invisible IT guy who only gets noticed when the office Wi-Fi goes down,
Yeah.
or the HVAC repairman who gets called out to a suburban home on a 90-degree day. Riker describes a matriarch barking orders at this repairman, treating him with a curt disdain she would never direct at a friend or a boss.
She doesn't ask his name.
Doesn't look him in the eye, doesn't offer him a glass of water. To her, according to Riker, he's a sentient tool, a wrench with a pulse.
And this raises an important question that Riker wants his readers to confront. What is the psychological impact of this phenomenon? Because he isn't just complaining about bad manners.
Right.
He is speaking directly to an entire demographic of men who feel they're the foundational infrastructure of society. They keep the lights on, they fix the plumbing, they maintain the server farms.
The invisible backbone.
Yet, Riker argues, they receive zero empathy or social acknowledgement from the culture at large. They are ghosted by society while actively holding it up.
It reminds me of that old documentary about the sanitation workers in New York City. You don't think about the intricate system of waste removal until the garbage piles up on the sidewalk and the smell hits your apartment.
That's a great parallel.
Riker is essentially taking that specific blue-collar invisibility and applying it to the entire male gender's standing in society.
Yeah.
He calls it a profound psychological crisis.
He does.
He says a man transitions from invisible in his youth to disposable in his adulthood. You become just a resource node, a tax mule. And he argues that once your utility is exhausted when you retire or get injured or lose your wealth, you're discarded back into the void.
It's a haunting description.
It's like being the stage upon which a play is performed. And when the play is over, the set is just struck and burned.
Precisely. And what makes Riker's argument so controversial is that he doesn't just present this as a cultural complaint or a symptom of late-stage capitalism.
No, he goes much deeper.
He attempts to root it in objective biological determinism. He argues that this depeopling isn't a mistake of the culture, but the harsh reality of human nature functioning precisely as it evolved to function on the primordial savanna.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he moves from this idea of social invisibility right into evolutionary psychology. This brings us to the second major part of his thesis, the dual mating strategy.
Yes. To understand this section, we have to look at his reliance on the concept of hypergamy.
Let's define that.
For listeners unfamiliar with the term, hypergamy is the evolutionary biology concept suggesting that females of a species are instinctively driven to mate with males of higher status, physical prowess, or resource-gathering ability than themselves.
Okay.
Riker explicitly uses a very blunt phrase common in the manosphere, alpha fucks, beta bucks. He uses that to describe how this manifests in modern humans.
Let's unpack that phrasing. It's abrasive, sure, but he uses it as a core biological taxonomy. What exactly are the mechanics of this dual strategy?
In his analysis, women are evolutionarily wired with a bifurcated approach to mating. First, they seek out the top 20% of men, the alphas.
The top tier.
These are men who possess high genetic fitness, physical dominance, dark triad personality traits like narcissism or Machiavellianism, and the ability to provide short-term excitement and strong immune system genes for offspring.
Right.
Riker claims women spend their prime fertility years seeking out these high-tier men, competing fiercely for their temporary attention, even knowing these men will not commit.
Right, because the alpha has no biological incentive to commit.
Yeah.
His evolutionary imperative is to spread his genetics as widely as possible.
Exactly.
But then, Riker introduces the flip side of the strategy. He argues that as a woman ages, or after she's secured genetic material from an alpha, her biological priorities shift.
They do.
She then seeks out the bottom 80% of men, the betas, strictly for long-term resource provisioning, financial stability, and assistance in raising offspring.
Which leads Riker to outline what he calls the good man paradox. This is a crucial and frankly devastating element of his argument.
Let's hear it.
He claims that the virtue society traditionally tells young boys to cultivate loyalty, provision, patience, stability, self-sacrifice are actually inherently boring to the female limbic system.
I want to clarify that distinction he makes between the limbic system and the frontal cortex.
It's an important one.
He argues that a woman might use her frontal cortex, her logical brain, to say, I want a nice, stable guy who treats me well.
Oh.
But her limbic system, her ancient, emotional, reptilian brain, is not aroused by stability. It's aroused by danger, competence, and dominance.
That is exactly his premise. He asserts that the beta male provides the resources but receives no genuine instinctual passion in return. He's actively punished for his virtues.
Wow.
The author claims that the woman rewards the chaos and unpredictability of the bad boy with her youth, her beauty, and her genuine desire, and then she rewards the stability of the good man with the privilege of paying her mortgage and funding her lifestyle when she's older.
It is a brutal assessment. But if he's claiming that this is hardwired biological determinism, how does he account for men who do find success in traditional marriages? Does he view them as outliers or just unaware they're in the trap?
According to Riker, the successful traditional marriage in the modern era is largely an illusion. He views the men in those situations as either statistical anomalies or, more likely, men who are simply unaware of their own utility.
Ignorance is bliss kind of thing.
Sort of. If we connect this to the bigger picture Riker is painting, he views this entire dynamic as a spiritual fraud. The average man, the beta provider, is effectively forced by the social contract to underwrite the offspring and the lifestyle choices of the very sexual strategy that excluded him.
That's dark.
He is financing his own genetic obsolescence in the marketplace.
So what does this all mean for the listener who's following Riker's logic? If you accept this premise that the biological deck is stacked entirely against the average man, how does he advise his readers to react?
Riker's deduction is stark. He argues that in this current gynocentric system, a system centered around female imperatives, commitment is not a virtue at all.
He frames it as a surrender.
He does. Riker states that to commit to a modern woman under these biological and legal conditions is to sign a confession of your own low sexual market value. You are negotiating against yourself. The winners in this marketplace, he says, don't lock it down. They keep playing because they have options.
The language he uses here is incredibly striking.
Yes.
He literally says there is nothing noble in being the sucker at the table. He's telling these men that they need to withdraw their consent to be exploited. He sees the good man as a utility harvested by a system that actively despises him.
That realization of systemic exploitation is the bridge to the next major section of his manifesto. Riker doesn't believe this biological reality exists in a vacuum.
Right, the savannah was one thing.
But he argues that this biological female imperative has been weaponized and codified by the institutions of Western civilization.
Let's pivot to the historical and institutional focus of the book, because this is where his scope widens massively. Riker makes the bold claim that Western civilization's institutions, education, law, media, medicine, corporate HR, have been completely captured.
Completely captured.
And he points the finger directly at what he calls the cultural Marxist pathogen and intersectional feminism.
To understand Riker's argument here, we have to trace the intellectual lineage he sets up. He doesn't just blame modern social media, he points back to the Frankfurt School. Specifically, he references mid-20th century thinkers like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse.
Let's slow down here. Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism are terms that get thrown around a lot in political discourse, often without much definition. Who were Adorno and Horkheimer, and what did they actually do?
The Frankfurt School was a group of scholars associated with the Institute for Social Research, founded in Germany in the 1920s.
Right.
They were Marxist theorists who were trying to understand why the working class revolutions predicted by Karl Marx hadn't swept across Western Europe. When the Nazis rose to power, many of these scholars fled to the United States, specifically to Columbia University.
Okay, following.
They developed what is known as critical theory. Unlike traditional theory, which tries to understand or explain society, critical theory's explicit goal is to critique and change society as a whole, specifically by uncovering hidden power structures and forms of domination.
So they were academics looking at power dynamics. How does Riker connect 1930s German academics to 2025 modern feminism?
Riker argues that traditional Marxism focused on economic class, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. When that failed to spark a revolution in the prosperous West, Riker claims these theorists shifted their focus from economics to culture.
I see.
They substituted class with gender, race, and sexual orientation. Riker argues that their stated academic goal of deconstructing the bourgeoisie was, in practical reality, a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse for what exactly?
For dismantling the nuclear family and what he terms the castration of the productive male.
Heavy words.
Riker asserts that cultural Marxism functions by inverting the natural hierarchy of values. It elevates the perceived victim above the victor and weakness above strength.
Okay.
He claims they systematically replaced classical logic with grievance and empirical reality with subjective feelings. By framing the traditional productive male as the ultimate oppressor, the new bourgeoisie, they created a moral justification for extracting his resources.
And this is where he introduces one of the most provocative, highly charged concepts in the entire text, Mein Kampf. He uses this term deliberately, playing off the title of Adolf Hitler's manifesto to describe modern feminism. He sees feminism not as a movement for equal rights, but as a totalitarian secular religion of collective guilt, specifically designed to demonize men as an oppressor class.
The terminology is undeniably extreme, and it's intended to shock the reader into viewing feminism not as a benign push for equality, but as a hostile ideological takeover.
Right.
To support this, he compares the foundational texts of radical feminism to modern academic literature. He specifically cites the SEM Manifesto by Valerie Solanas.
For listeners who haven't heard of it, the SEM Manifesto was written in the late 1960s. SEM famously stood for the Society for Cutting Up Men.
Yes, it did.
Solanas, who later attempted to assassinate Andy Warhol, literally advocated for the systematic elimination of the male sex, calling men biological accidents.
Exactly. And Riker's argument is that while mainstream society dismisses Solanas as a fringe lunatic, her underlying premise that men are inherently toxic and unnecessary has simply been laundered into academic respectability. He claims that modern intersectional feminist texts differ from Solanas only in tone and vocabulary, not in their ultimate intent to erase masculine influence from society.
He even brings in Douglas Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds, to bolster this point.
He does.
Riker completely agrees with Murray's thesis that intersectionality functions as a new religion for a post-religious age. It has its own priests in the form of diversity consultants, its own sacraments in the form of public apologies and cancellations, and most importantly, its own conception of original sin.
And according to Riker, that original sin is simply being born male, straight, and white.
What's fascinating here is how he argues this religion operates practically in society. He says it relies on a philosophical Ponzi scheme.
A Ponzi scheme.
It demands that men accept collective historical guilt for the sins of ancestors they never met, while simultaneously demanding that those same modern men continue to prop up the entire physical and economic infrastructure of civilization.
He calls it a performative contradiction. You are the ultimate oppressor, but you are also legally and morally required to pay the bills for the oppressed.
He makes a strong point about the futility of debating this ideology. He points out that you can't use logic to dismantle a faith. If you're debating a radical feminist, Riker says, you aren't having a political discussion. You're having a theological dispute with a cult member.
It's a closed loop.
Right. He advises his readers not to argue on their terms because the entire framework is designed to elicit emotional blackmail, not to arrive at an objective truth.
And he insists that this ideological capture isn't just theoretical. It isn't confined to gender studies departments on university campuses. He argues it has been codified into hard economic and legal systems, creating what he calls the tax farm.
Yes. Let's look at the hard data Riker claims to be using to support this theory of a gynocentric leviathan. He gets very specific about macroeconomics here.
Riker unpacks the tax argument with a very specific data-driven narrative. He cites data from the IRS and the Tax Foundation, claiming that the top 20% of earners pay nearly 70% of all federal income tax.
That's a huge chunk.
He then points out that this demographic of high earners is overwhelmingly male. In contrast, he argues that women, when viewed collectively as a macroeconomic demographic, are net consumers of state resources through subsidized healthcare, public education, and welfare administration.
I want to make sure we understand the mechanics of his claim. Is he saying women don't pay taxes?
No, he acknowledges that women pay taxes, but he is looking at the net balance. He argues that over the course of a lifetime, the average woman consumes more in state-funded services than she pays into the system in taxes.
Right.
Conversely, the average man, particularly the high-earning man, pays significantly more into the system than he will ever extract in services.
So he views the state itself as a massive coercive wealth transfer mechanism. It's taking resources from the male producers at the point of a gun because tax evasion results in prison and giving those resources to the female consumers.
Exactly.
He says you're working yourself into an early grave to fund a system that actively teaches young boys in public schools that their masculinity is toxic and teaches young girls that they are perpetual victims deserving of state subsidy.
He constructs a formal logical syllogism to make this point crystal clear. Premise A. The state extracts resources primarily from men through taxation.
Right.
Premise B. The state uses those resources to fund institutions that demonize and disempower men through legislation and cultural stigma. His conclusion is that men are actively financing their own oppression and erasure. He calls it buying the bullets for your own execution.
And nowhere is this more apparent to him than in the legal system. specifically the family courts.
Oh, absolutely.
He brings up some incredibly sobering claims here. He highlights data suggesting that family courts award sole or primary custody to mothers in roughly 80% of contested cases.
80%.
To Riker, this proves the courts do not view fathers as equal parents, but as nothing more than biological sperm donors and ATM machines. He calls these divorced fathers refugees of the gynocracy, men who are stripped of their assets, their homes, and their children through no-fault divorce, yet they're still forced to pay for a family they no longer have access to.
He goes even further into the legal weeds by analyzing a doctrine known as the presumption of paternity.
This is a wild concept. Can you explain the legal mechanics of this? Because
Yeah.
it sounds almost archaic.
It is archaic. It's rooted in English common law.
Yeah.
Under the presumption of paternity, if a man is married to a woman when she gives birth, the law automatically presumes he is the father. He is legally and financially responsible for that child. Historically, before DNA testing, this made sense to ensure children were provided for. However, Riker points out that in many modern jurisdictions, even if a man subsequently discovers through a DNA test that his wife was unfaithful and the child is biologically not his, the court can still force him to pay child support.
Wait, so even if a DNA test definitively proves he is not the biological father, the state can still legally compel him to pay for the child's upbringing?
Yes, the courts often rule based on what they term the best interest of the child, arguing that if the man has acted as a father figure, breaking that financial bond would be harmful to the child. The court prioritizes the financial stability of the mother and child over the genetic reality and the consent of the male.
Riker likens this to a system of blatant state-enforced slavery. He argues it legally mandates men to finance the offspring of the alpha who slept with their wife.
Beta bucks funding alpha fucks.
Exactly. He says the state acts as an armed enforcer to ensure the beta bucks continue to flow, even after the alpha fucks have moved on. It is an incredibly dark, cynical view of the social contract. He believes the contract hasn't just been broken, it's been burned to ashes.
This systemic extraction leads us directly to how Riker views the physical daily reality of men in society. He draws a very sharp, deliberate contrast to the well-known feminist concept of the glass ceiling.
Right.
Riker argues that while feminists focus all their academic and media energy on the boardroom complaining about a lack of female CEOs, they entirely ignore the fact that the bottom 80% of men occupy what he calls the glass cellar.
The glass cellar. This is such a powerful visualization. Think about the occupations he lists here. He's talking about the men waist deep in raw sewage maintaining city plumbing, the men climbing electrical poles in freezing rain to restore power,
The dangerous jobs.
the long-haul truckers sleeping in cramped cabs to deliver groceries, men logging in treacherous forests, deep-sea fishing in the Bering Sea, and dying of black lung in coal mines. These are the men who keep the supply chains moving, the water clean, and the lights on.
And he backs this up with some haunting statistics to highlight what he calls the total erasure of male suffering.
Girling.
He points out that men make up over 90% of workplace fatalities. They make up the vast majority of the unsheltered homeless population. Furthermore, men commit suicide at 3.5 to 4 times the rate of women in the Anglosphere.
4 times the rate.
Yet, Riker argues, society responds to this immense mountain of male suffering with a collective yawn.
I have to ask, why does he think the apathy is so absolute? Why is society seemingly blind to this?
Riker argues that acknowledging male suffering would break the fundamental oppressor-oppressed binary that cultural Marxism relies upon. If men are the ultimate oppressors enjoying patriarchal privilege, then you cannot acknowledge that they make up the majority of suicides and workplace deaths. Doing so would collapse the narrative. Therefore, their suffering must be ignored or reframed as their own fault.
He writes that when a middle-class woman cries about a microaggression at the office, the media wails in unison, and HR writes a new policy. But when a working-class man commits suicide because he lost his kids in family court, it's just a statistic, a footnote.
Exactly.
He claims the suffering of the 80% is statistically irrelevant to the modern matriarchy. The narrative of male tears is mocked on coffee mugs as a sign of toxic masculinity, rather than recognized as a genuine cry for help from an exploited class.
This apathy, according to Riker, is the fingerprint of a culture that views its male population as human kindling, something to be burned up to keep the rest of society warm. To illustrate the sheer leverage these men actually hold but fail to utilize, he introduces an incredibly compelling thought experiment, the day without a man hypothesis.
Oh, this part of the book is intense. Walk us through this hypothetical scenario. What happens if the men in the glass cellar just stop?
Riker hypothesizes what would happen if men simply withdrew their labor and protection for just 48 hours. If the men in the sewers, on the power grids, in the trucking fleets, and in the police forces simply stayed home.
He maps out the collapse hour by hour. Within the first few hours, the power grid starts to destabilize because there are no linemen to fix localized faults. Traffic grinds to a halt because logistics and delivery systems fail.
Right.
Within 24 hours, the water pressure drops and the sewers begin to back up into the streets. Within 48 hours, grocery store shelves are bare. And without police protection, society collapses into a violent Mad Max nightmare almost instantly.
And this is a core piece of his puzzle. Riker argues that feminism and the cultural Marxist state demonize masculinity precisely because they subconsciously fear men realizing this ultimate leverage.
They need to keep them distracted.
They have to keep men feeling guilty, burdened by original sin, distracted by sports and pornography, and terrified of being labeled misogynists. So they never simply stop signing the tax checks and doing the dangerous labor.
It's like he's trying to wake his readers up from a simulation. He wants them to realize they hold all the cards, but they've been hypnotized into folding their hand. Which brings us to the tools he offers to break out of this hypnosis.
Yes, the philosophical arsenal.
He doesn't just present the problem. He offers a philosophical arsenal for men to fight back. He calls it the trivium sword.
The trivium refers to the classical educational foundations that were taught for centuries. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar is the mechanics of language, logic is the mechanics of thought and analysis, and rhetoric is the mechanics of communicating and persuading.
Okay.
Riker insists that the modern educational system, which he believes is conquered by ideological capture, deliberately removed these tools from the curriculum to leave young men defenseless against emotional hysteria and manipulation.
He is urging his readers to reclaim classical education, explicitly citing philosophers like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. But how does he apply this ancient philosophy to modern gender dynamics?
He sets up a massive philosophical dichotomy. On one side, you have logos. He defines logos, a Greek term often meaning word, reason, or plan, as fundamentally masculine. It is objective, rooted in logic, reason, empirical data, and the immutable laws of physics. It's the force that categorizes the world, builds structure, and demands evidence.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have eros. He defines eros as feminine, subjective, emotional, and entropic. He links eros directly to modern academic concepts like standpoint epistemology.
Let's pause on standpoint epistemology because that is a heady academic term that drives a lot of his critique. For someone who isn't deep into modern sociological theory, what does that actually look like in everyday life?
It's a crucial concept to define. Imagine a car crash at an intersection. In a world governed by logos, you would determine what happened by looking at objective evidence. Tire marks, traffic camera footage, the speed of the vehicles. You seek an objective, universal truth.
Right.
Standpoint epistemology, however, argues that truth is entirely relative to a person's social standing, specifically their status as an oppressed person. It argues that marginalized groups have a unique, superior insight into reality simply because they are marginalized. Therefore, their lived experience or their feelings about the car crash are treated as more valid than objective measurements.
So Riker's arguing that this shift prioritizes feelings over facts. He uses Arthur Schopenhauer's famously controversial essay on women to argue that women are inherently predisposed to see the truth only through the lens of how it serves their immediate emotional needs.
He does.
He claims that elevating this subjective eros over objective logos is a reversion to primeval chaos. He sees Western civilization not as a patriarchy oppressing women, but as the historical manifestation of logos waging a desperate, ongoing war against the encroaching chaos of eros.
And he uses this exact framework of logos to completely deconstruct the myth of toxic masculinity. We hear that term everywhere in modern media, usually to describe negative male behavior. But Riker argues that the traits labeled toxic stoicism, aggression, risk-taking, tribalism, and extreme competitiveness are not toxic at all.
He reframes them entirely. He says these traits are the essential kinetic energy required to build nations, invent electricity, conquer frontiers, and protect borders from hostile invaders.
What's fascinating here is his linguistic analysis of the term itself. He claims toxic masculinity is a linguistic weapon designed specifically to pathologize strength.
Pathologized strength.
He argues that a man who beats his wife or acts without discipline is not displaying toxic masculinity. Rather, he is displaying the total absence of masculinity. True masculinity, under logos, is controlled aggression. By labeling these core protective traits as inherently toxic, society is disarming its protectors. It is attacking the very structural columns that keep the roof from caving in.
So how does a man armed with this trivium sword, this understanding of logic and rhetoric, actually operate in the real world? When the HR department calls him in or Twitter tries to cancel him, how does he face the mob?
Riker points his readers toward ancient Stoicism, specifically the concepts of memento mori, remember that you must die, and contemptus mundi, contempt for the world. He argues that if you truly internalize that all biological entities inevitably die and return to dust, then fearing social labels becomes logically incoherent.
The way he phrases this is so striking. He says fearing cancellation or fearing being called an incel, a misogynist, or toxic is logically weak. Why? Because you're fearing the opinion of a mob composed of individuals who, in his words, cannot change your own tire, let alone the course of history.
Exactly.
If we're all destined for the grave, the only thing that matters is your standing with objective reality, your adherence to logos, not your standing with a herd of sheep. He wants his readers to cultivate a rational, ice-cold disdain for a society that elevates the mediocre while demonizing the competent.
Which logically leads us to the final, actionable section of his manifesto. If the system is rigged from top to bottom, if the institutions are captured by cultural Marxists, if the family courts are designed to enslave you, and if your very biological nature is pathologized as toxic, what is the rational response?
This is where he pivots from theory to action. How exactly does he propose men execute this? Because he explicitly says the answer is not political reform. He does not want men to complain on the internet. He does not want them to vote for a specific candidate. And he absolutely does not want them to try to change the system from within.
Exactly. He believes the ship has already hit the iceberg. He wants them to secede. He calls for a digital exodus.
He details this as a neotech withdrawal, or aligning with MGTOW. For listeners who might not spend time on these specific internet forums, what is MGTOW?
MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. It is a largely online movement of men who have decided to swear off romantic relationships, cohabitation, and marriage with women altogether. They believe the legal and emotional risks far outweigh the benefits.
Right.
Riker takes the MGTOW philosophy and expands it into a total psychological and economic secession. He wants his readers to build what he calls a kingdom of one, where their sovereignty is absolute.
The first step in this exodus, he says, is psychological. He introduces a concept called amused mastery. Since he views the gynocentric world as an emotional, solipsistic storm of chaos, he advises men to look at emotional manipulation with the clinical detachment of a parent watching a toddler throw a tantrum in a supermarket.
The key to amused mastery is not reacting. You refuse to let their chaos penetrate your mental fortress. You do not argue, you do not justify yourself, you simply observe and smirk. Most importantly, you completely and utterly refuse to seek female validation. Riker argues that seeking approval from a system that views you merely as an appliance is the very definition of slavery.
And once you have that psychological fortress built, he moves to the physical and economic infrastructure of the exodus. He enthusiastically pitches what he calls the blockchain solution. He wants men to build parallel institutions in the digital ether. Why Bitcoin specifically? Why not just buy gold or put money in a Swiss bank account?
Because of the technological mechanics of cryptocurrency, he views Bitcoin not just as a financial investment, but as a cryptographic mechanism of escape. Unlike fiat currency, which is government-issued money like the US dollar that is subject to inflation and centralized control, Bitcoin operates on a decentralized ledger.
Right.
If your wealth is in a bank, a family court judge can freeze your assets, garnish your wages, or seize your accounts with a stroke of a pen.
But with Bitcoin.
With Bitcoin, if you memorize your 12-word seed phrase, your wealth exists solely in your head. It is immutable and permissionless. A family court judge cannot subpoena a decentralized ledger. They cannot seize what they cannot access mathematically. Riker sees Bitcoin as a sovereign, impenetrable vault that the gynocentric state cannot crack. It is the ultimate defunding of the tax farm.
It's a total bypass of the system. He says use Bitcoin to escape the family courts. Use the gig economy and anonymous online businesses to bypass corporate HR departments and diversity commissars who want to fire you for your political beliefs. He envisions a future of creating decentralized, male-only, logocentric brotherhoods, networks where merit, skill, and honor are the only currency, and emotional blackmail is completely worthless.
If we summarize Riker's ultimate call to action, it is a profound transmutation of pain into power. He tells his readers to stop negotiating with a culture that hates them and start building their own reality. He wants them to take the dark energy of feeling betrayed, of being discarded, of being depeopled, and transmute it into relentless physical fitness, aggressive decentralized wealth accumulation, and unassailable intellectual domination.
The best revenge is massive, undeniable success. He wants these men to become undeniable forces of nature, intellectual and physical storms that simply cannot be ignored or canceled. He believes that by exiting the matrix, withdrawing their utility from the state, and building these parallel digital structures, men will eventually force the collapse of the Eros-driven society. Out of those ashes, they will reconstruct the logos brick by brick and initiate a new golden age.
It is a sweeping, apocalyptic, and highly systematic worldview. And regardless of where you, the listener, stand on Riker's extremely polarizing views, whether you see him as a visionary or a dangerous radical, there is a final provocative thought we must leave you with to mull over on your own.
What is the ultimate takeaway here?
The sheer popularity of texts like this, the fact that thousands of men are consuming and adopting this philosophy, highlights a profound, undeniable fracture in the modern social contract. It forces us to ask a critical, existential question. How long can a society actually sustain itself when the foundational narratives of men and women have become so deeply antagonistic, so mistrustful, and seemingly irreconcilable? When the two halves of the human species view each other not as partners, but as predators and parasites.
That is the question of the decade, isn't it? We've covered a massive amount of ground today, unpacking the intricate, controversial mechanics of this incredibly intense book. Just as a reminder, the title we review today is 80% of Men Are Depeopled. Women see only the top 20% of men, written by Conrad Riker.
It is a text that certainly demands a critical, analytical eye. Whether you view it as a prophetic warning regarding the collapse of masculinity or a manifestation of extreme societal resentment.
Absolutely. And listen, as we always say, we want you to be able to dive into the primary source material and judge it for yourself. Do not just take our word for it. If you want to read this explosive manifesto and see the exact arguments, data points, and philosophical frameworks we broke down today, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
Reading the source text directly is always the best way to truly understand the architecture of an author's argument, especially one this provocative.
And if you want to dive even deeper into his strategic deployments of logic and follow his ongoing commentary on these issues, make sure you tell your friends to follow @Conrad Riker at Substack. Thank you so much for taking this intense ride with us today. We know it was a heavy, complicated topic, but you stuck with it, and we love you for that. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a deep dive. We'll see you next time.